So now we've heard from the accountant. It's now time to hear from the lawyer. So after you've done your valuation and you've worked out that you actually want to buy this business and how much you want to pay for it and all that sort of stuff.
We'll spend your money.
What do you now need? Yeah. What do you now need to do? I don't know whether he got your fee accurate in his model there, James.
No, never.
No. Yeah. So I'll let James do his own intro, but right now we're going to be going through a little bit around the other question that we get a lot is like, and you would have heard in, for example, Jake's presentation, things like get in a bunch of LOIs, make sure you're getting those reps in, use that as an opportunity to then work out how you make it to the next step. James is going to get a bit practical about what that actually means and looks like. So over to you, James.
Jason's just told you how to make money. I'm now going to tell you the boring ways to spend money. And yesterday, lawyers got a really bad rap, and the reality is we probably should. So we're known as deal killers. Hopefully today I'm going to take you through the way we think about SME transactions. Just a little bit about us. So we're sort of two firms in one. We're a bit of a hybrid, a bit of a unique beast. So we've got Frank Law. We're a second generation corporate and commercial law firm. We've done plenty of SME transactions on buy and sell sides. And then we have Frank Advisory, which is a separate SME focused corporate advisory practice. We hold an AFSL, which enables us to do some fun things. Typically clients are two types, the SMEs, 3 to sort of 150 million rev, family owned, founder led businesses. And then the other side are kind of what we call sponsors. So search funders, family offices and private equity firms, typically in the lower to mid market. You probably, if you've seen one of the podcasts, I'm a massive fan of heavy industry. So we have two sort of verticals we kind of chase, or industries. We call them high vis, so slightly better term than maybe blue collar, but typically heavy industry, manufacturing, distribution, dry hire, wet hire, materials handling, logistics, etc. I love Kenworth. So there was a presentation yesterday with a Kenworth truck in it. Probably no one in the audience noticed that, but that's what I look at. So that's weird, but that's cool. And then human capital. So this has kind of been an interesting, rise recently, just by virtue of where we are. So we're based in Parramatta, but we've seen a lot of NDIS growth around us, and we have some very large players in that, aged care, professional services, consulting, engineers. And the theme between the two really is people. Right, so where there's typically people, you have problems. I think that was mentioned yesterday. And obviously employment law is one of the main things we do. So what do we do? So two separate sets here. So from a legal point of view, we do structuring broadly, so what we call upstream or downstream structuring. The way we kind of classify that is the upstream is think about it from an investment point of view and sort of management of returns. Downstream, sort of operating company risk protection below the line. M&A, end-to-end, corporate law, so capital raises, etc. Then the commercial law, so the difference being like contracts, day-to-day, sort of how do we manage the commercial relations between typically operating companies and other operating companies. Employment law, which we'll talk about for dispute resolution. And we have a subscription style service, which is an external in-house counsel where we plug in on a fixed monthly cost for most of our SMEs and clients. And then from an advisory point of view, it is strategy and growth, typically confined to acquisition-led. So we're involved in a number of roll-ups. So we design, implement, and then go and manage them. Capital raisings, both debt and equity, transaction advisory, buy and sell side, and then particularly around the transition from an SME or the readiness to take them to private equity, right? And depending on the private equity player, whether it be a minority, a majority, the blue collar, white collar, whatever it is, then finding that. And then post-transaction, typically, or capital event, is dealing with the family office that surrounds that and then rolling them into other things, right? So that's sort of us. Just to put a couple of faces, let me do this. Couple of faces, that's me. I wear a suit once a year. It's when we have corporate photos. This is Scott. Scott's grumpy. He's a chartered accountant. He's done about 120 billion worth of deals across North America and in Australia and Asia Pac. And then Baha's up the back, who sort of leads our legal division. We're generally friendly. We never ever wear clothes like that except for Baha. So next year you might have a new corporate photo. Today's session, there's three sort of things we want to do. The first is I want to lay out the process that should be followed in buying an SME. You'll probably understand that that doesn't get followed all the time, but this is the ideal process. The second is sort of equip you with some base building blocks of knowledge so that when there's that discussion, and maybe it's a proprietary search, you can have that early discussion with the seller and actually equip them to understand the expectations they're about to go through. And the third is we've developed sort of an acquisition starter pack. So it's been uploaded onto ETA Central. We've got an NDA that we like to use, that Go For Your Life. We've got sort of what we typically like to see as our offer letter. So a bit of background into a term sheet. I'm a big term sheet guy. I've seen a lot of really long-winded NBIOs. I've sat in front of a lot of clients who receive NBIOs and they have absolutely no idea what they mean. What they want to know is how much are they going to pay me, on what terms, and what are my role post-acquisition. So let's focus on those three things. And then we've uploaded a bolt-on checklist. So a lot of our clients are engaged in that kind of growth of, you can grow up 15%, organically, or you can slap on another company and sort of rocket your growth. A lot of our clients, though, struggle with the when to buy. When's the next? I think Ryan talked about this yesterday. So we've got a very high-level checklist that we go through that I've published. You can kind of do your assessment on your particular entity and work out, are we okay to look at a bolt-on, or maybe we need to internally fix some things up first, right? Recognising that in the room there's kind of the ETAs that are operating and then there's the ETAs that are searching. So we want to try and hit both of them. So disclaimer, like all things, this is not a legal disclaimer, but SME transactions are super messy. There is not a single deal that we've done that hasn't gone off script, and you just need to expect that. So, go into it eyes wide open, recognise that the seller is typically going into it eyes wide shut because they're like, this is new to me, and you've got to work hard to sort of relationally deal with that. They're much more about people than money. And so I think maybe it was Ryan said yesterday, I'm sorry if I get this wrong, but it was basically like buyer and seller should talk, lawyers piss them off, right? And actually it's 100% correct, right? We are the absolute worst people to start to negotiate your deal for you. Because our natural bias is to go risk, protect you. We have a duty to the court to do that. We're the worst person to try and get a commercial deal done. What you need is a deal team that understands you're trying to get a deal done, and then you can work together. But fundamentally, the relationship has to land the deal. It's not going to be landed between us and their lawyer, right? And the other thing is just be prepared for the strange thing. Maybe it's a death during that process. Maybe it's an external shock to the business. Maybe it's, you uncover, as Jason said, the mistress in the due diligence or whatever it is, or the cattle that shouldn't be on the balance sheet, whatever it is. Just be prepared for something. It will inevitably come up. So broadly, we think there's 8 steps. Lots of people get to 7 and they forget about probably the most important, which is 8, right? Which is actually your first 90 days. So I'm going to just high level go through all of this. I'm not touching on sort of the capital raise aspect or any of that. That's a whole nother ball game, and we can talk about that. But I'm going to take you through these 8 at a high level and try and annotate, I guess, from a human point of view, how certainly our sellers from an SME point of view think, and obviously our experience with acting for the buy side as well. And at each point, feel free to interrupt me. Otherwise, I'll just sort of power through. So first is target identification. And I'm going to follow the same sort of process throughout this. So we're going to look at core items and then sort of what professionals you should have engaged at that time, or in case you should not have engaged. So the core items in our view for a successful is like, what's the thesis, right? Are you just looking at anything, are you spraying and praying, or you have a really tight thesis? So for instance, in a roll-up, like if we've got an NDIS roll-up working on at the moment, it's very clear. It's like, we don't care where you are, we don't care how big your company is, we just need you to be registered in the NDIS. Right? And you think, okay, well, that's pretty broad. It's great. Well, we've got a national play. It doesn't bother us. We just need that one little sliver. And if we've got that, then we can deal with the rest. Right? But the thesis of why. So in this case, our client's looking at a listing in 4 years, and it's just about volume now. So we've built the base, and now we're going to expand the volume. But you're going to have a thesis. Second is understand your intermediaries. So there's brokers, there's corporate advisors, there's accountants, there's a whole list of intermediaries there. You need to understand them, you need to understand how you're going to nurture them, and don't forget about them in the process, right? The broker is just like us, they're good killers of deals. And the reality is they want to get paid a commission, and if you can kind of make that part of the deal and work it out and help them along the way, then if you get them on side, they can actually be a really good advocate for you. But you need to understand who they are, who you're going to target, and the type of broker is important. So SBX is like the number one hospitality broker in Sydney Business Exchange. They're terrible, like, to be blunt. Great to buy a cafe off, but absolutely terrible for anything else. So if you're looking for something in manufacturing and it pops up on SBX, I can almost guarantee you will have a horrible experience, right? But it also might be a bargain. So, you kind of par for the course, right? But understand where you're getting deals from and the quality of that, okay? Not to shout out, but Ben at Morgan's, their quality is very high in terms of their IMs. You kind of get decent information, you can make assessments, but go through a process, and the easiest way is just start inquiring on them and then start to rank them and keep a file of actually ranked intermediaries. The other group of intermediaries that aren't listed as kind of the mid-market, lower to mid-market corporate advisors like ourselves, we have active deals that we don't publish. PKF have a published deal sheet. You can get that off them. There's a bunch of other sort of in that mid-market, RSM, et cetera, that you actually can get on and get access to deals before they go to market. They don't get published. Some of them do get put on Resolve now, but get out, get in front of an intermediary and have that conversation. The other one is obviously set up your legal entity, right? You say flippantly, but actually it's a pretty important point. If the exit is going to happen, what's the structure? How are you buying it? Have you thought about what the end event is? Do you have a buy and sell strategy? Do you have a buy and hold strategy? Are we playing a legacy play here? Like, all these questions actually need to be asked. It's not simply set up a company and buy through that company, right? Because capital gains will absolutely destroy you on the exit and you'll significantly regret it. Or it might be the share. How are we structuring the shares? Are we setting up a particular discretionary trust, unit trusts, whatever the case may be? Do we have investors? Do we not? Like, all of that needs to be thought about here. And hopefully it's in your thesis, and then you can get that set up really quickly. And then obviously your NDA, right? It's pretty simple. If you go to a broker, they'll send you a CA or an NDA. Just sign it. To be blunt, it's pretty useless. If you're dealing with a mid-market intermediary, they'll send you a much more detailed thing, and they'll want it redacted and all that jazz. But just have your own ready to go. If you've got a proprietary search, send it out, get it signed. It gives, certainly from our experience, our clients, gives them some comfort. The reality is it's relatively, like, you wouldn't litigate on one, and we would never advise someone to litigate on one, but it shows them that there's a bit of seriousness in the understanding of what information they're going to tell you. So professionals engaged at this stage, apart from setting up the legal entity and that advice, probably no one, right? But you should have already lined them all up. You should have had conversations with them, understood their place in the team, introduced them to each other so that when it's time to go, they know exactly who's they're going to be speaking to, why, and the process, and they actually understand the thesis. I like to understand, why are you wanting to buy, right? What's the rationale here? What's the play? Talk me through that so we've got a better understanding. The second is the offer stage, right? And this is everyone gets excited about this point, and this is really, I guess, important, right? Too often we see deals done and then they come later stages and we've missed considerable aspects that should have been thought about at this point, right? So the thesis evaluation tool, in our view, what that looks like is really clearly your thesis and then assessing, well, how do I assess whether this business fits that thesis? What are the 10 things or 15 things or whatever it is that we need to actually go through? And what are my non-negotiables? What are my negotiables? Right? And if you've got a non-negotiable and that flags, well, you've got to be very, very, very convicted that you can deal with that non-negotiable and proceed. Otherwise, just get rid of it. I think Jake's point this morning of kind of get them to a point and then get it off, and actually it makes a lot of sense, right? The financial model, which Jason's giving you a great leg up there, the term sheet, and then the diligence list, right? The diligence list is really important because the seller's going to want to know, what information do I have to provide you? Right? Most accountants will do an SME's books on the 20th of February the next year after year end. So if you're in July and say, hey, can we have your FY24 numbers? They'll say, yeah, sure, no worries. Hey, accountant, can you do this? Oh, no, it's not going to be ready for months, right? That's just the cadence. So in order to get actual data, by the time you get the data, I think this was mentioned yesterday, it's almost like 9 months out of date. So you got to actually prep the seller. What data am I going to need? How often am I going to need it? It's not a one hit, without it. You need a constant data flow, and you got to set them up for that. And then fundamentally, your term sheet, right? I'm a term sheet guy, right? I think non-binding indicative offers can be super long-winded. The market that you're buying, largely, even at the top end of your search market, fundamentally are founder-led, family-owned businesses. Quite honestly, not going to have advisors at this stage largely they don't want to spend the money. They're traditionally cheap. And this is all our client base, so I can say this from actual knowledge. They will just want to know those kind of three things. How much are you going to pay me? When are you going to pay me? And what am I doing after you own the business? Right? And the term sheet for me is just very simple. It's just plain language, bang, bang, bang. There it all is. You can take them through it. You can understand. It gives enough of understanding of the deal to then be able to sketch it out, but not too much that they kind of get the words, like what does all this mean? What's earnouts mean? It's like, just tell me very clearly and in plain language what this sets out, right? But there's a balance there. The term sheet is the architectural plans to design the house, which is the legal transaction docs. So if you go too light, you end up with a bunch of questions downstream, which can be really difficult to manage. So you've got to have enough of a plain language term sheet and approach, but then tackle all of the really hard conversations up front, right? One of them that comes up every single transaction is net working capital, right? You have to understand that as best as you possibly can, and then give them some resources and explain that to the seller. Otherwise, they just don't get it, okay? So you got to tackle that up front. Otherwise, we've seen transactions derail because, oh, well, we forgot about that. It's like, oh, it's a pretty big thing to forget about in the discussion, right? So at this point, your professionals should be engaged. From our point of view, we like to get engaged very early, right? Even if it's let's have a conversation, then a term sheet comes through that might be drafted initially by the buyer, and we'll sit and we'll actually go through it, edit what we need. We'll actually think about, oh, what's the SPA going to look like? All right, how does that work? And let's work through that basis, right? But early, the better, but really be clear on term sheet must reflect the business you're buying, right? If you're a Pacific Equity Partners and you're dropping into a secondary sale from another private equity firm, their NBIOs can be as long as anything, right? They don't care. They're dealing with professional buyers. If you're buying off a blue collar who's going to literally have grease on his hands reading the paper or can barely log into his email, like that's the person you got to deal with, right? Which there are great deals out there to be done. You got to recognise that's the person you're actually going to be reading. They're not going to give it to their lawyer. They'll give it to their accountant, who, to be blunt, in that sort of SME land, probably doesn't know more than the owner. They just understand some of the terms better, right? So we've got to be super clear on that. The third stage is, assuming we get to an agreement on term sheet, is we enter into diligence. Now, diligence can be as big and as wide and as deep as you like, right? The reality is, if you have raised a fund, you have limited capital. If you are self-funded, you have even less capital. So how do we manage that process, right? The reality is, one, having a really tight thesis, so you're only chasing deals that absolutely you want to transact on. Two is doing a lot of the work up front to build the relational trust, to get them to give you the information that you kind of get a sense. Three is you're on site. You've ideally had a couple of walkthroughs, so you're looking at going, okay, there's absolutely no high vis on this site. We might have a problem, right? Okay, what are the machinery like? Okay, there's a fair amount of maintenance that needs to happen. I was at a site on Wednesday. They were in dry hire, toilets dry hire. 4,000 portable loos. That's a lot of portable loos. And we walked around the site, big site, absolute mess of a site. Very little sort of highlights on the ground. So you're just thinking, okay, there's a fair amount of questionable WHS going on. Wonder what the the questions I go in my head is I wonder what their workers' comp's like. Wonder if that's up to date. Going to the office, paperwork's all right. Digitised systems, so that's good. So you're absorbing, understanding, okay, from a diligence point of view, there's kind of your financial diligence, everyone knows about. There's legal diligence, which most people know about. Operational diligence can be anything, right, and very specific. And then we go into, if you're buying typically shares, you want to do a tax due diligence at the same time. So when you're on site, if you've had the couple of meetings, the relational meetings, you've got the documents, this due diligence can actually be tightened up as to what are the core issues that you think are outside of the traditional areas that you will have advisors give advice on. This is where you as a searcher are spreading some risk, right? I have an enormously large professional indemnity insurance policy because people ask me to provide advice on certain things, right? So lean on that. This is how you spread some risk, right? You pay for it. That's why costs are costs. And the reality is you're asking them to provide an opinion. You're putting some risk onto them, right? And so therefore, if anything goes wrong, which it does, at least there's an opportunity to come back, right? There may be some other person that might get it wrong, and an indemnity insurer might be able to stump up some cash, right? We've had a matter in the office that's finished now, but they didn't engage due diligence advisors. They came to us once they realised they were in the business and they'd been misled, and they were down $1 million up front. They'd signed on to essentially take over some financing instruments from CBA to the tune of $2.5 million, and then realised during the process the buyer had completely taken all of the clients out of the main entity, put it into a new entity that he had set up the day after they signed the term sheet, right? And it was clear as anything. They were left with a shell of a company with a director who was like, "Oh, I didn't do anything." Like, well, you literally signed the documents from ASIC to say set up this new company, and they're left. So now they're litigating against someone who they've got to take all these steps through because they didn't get advice at the right time. And it just would have flagged on your normal searches, right? The other thing with that deal, which is interesting, is they got pinged by a regulator and they couldn't sell a particular product that he said was relative and material to the earnings. So this particular product they couldn't sell anymore. The regulator said, "No, we're banning you from selling that." That would have flagged in your regulatory DD, and they just wouldn't have transacted. Right? So now they're going through the Supreme Court process, or have been through that, have spent a ridiculous amount of money, got something back, but the reality is that would have been stopped if they'd actually engaged at the right time. Right? So diligence is super important. Everyone knows that, but actually when the rubber hits the road, it is really important. It can be done quickly. It doesn't need to be a 7-month process, but the reality is you need to be clear as to how confident you are in this business to take it to the next level. And even when you have that absolute confidence, you need to be prepared that DD might show something that you do not like, right? And in fact, an advisor might say, you shouldn't buy this business, right? You need to be prepared to hear that. And I'll come to some issues on that before. But so commonly, financial, legal, and commercial and operational and tax are kind of the big four. In SME deals, you get a split between sort of asset sales and share sales, or business sales and share sales. Certainly share sales, you need to be doing your tax DD. Then you'll have your regulatory and your other IP, technology, whatever, that needs to be done. And the other thing in all of this is you pay all this money, right? This is a huge frustration one. You pay all this money out to get DD, and then I very rarely see an operational improvement plan on the back of the DD. So what I see is, great, thank you for the risk, put it at the bottom drawer, and then people go, well, what do I do with that? Well, actually, that's the roadmap on how you can address the risks and recognise that if you are selling at a future date, the multiple that is paid is relative to the proportion of earnings, or the value of the quantum of earnings, and the risk relative to the asset, as Jason's just showed us. So if we can lower the risk by addressing FDD concerns and LDD concerns and operational concerns, then we're improving the asset's value from day one, right? So the very expensive reports you get done, you should be using them, right? The list of what are the operational improvements, how are we going to stagger them out, who can lead that, because day one you're not going to have capacity. How do we improve? Common's really employment law, right? Most SMEs have very, very poor employment relations systems, so how do we improve that? Like, we can lay out a plan really clearly on just step-by-step improvements that actually get you into a better position. So professionals engaged, absolutely. Like, if you're doing this yourself, unless it's a really, really small transaction, 50 grand, even at that point, I reckon there's probably value in getting something done, or at least having some formula engaged in that process. So absolutely, you need to get professionals engaged on this. This is the most frustrating part for most of our buyers and most of our sellers, because there's a disconnect between the seller's accountant, typically, and the buyer's financial due diligence advisor. The seller's accountant's thinking, if this goes through, I've lost an accountant. In this room, it's probably a decent-sized account for that firm. And the buyer's going, just give me the information. I just need this information. Here's my RFI, give me the information, right? Typically, there's an exchange of RFIs, so requests for informations, in this process. And it's that time, so I think Luke mentioned time, the cycle of time to come back, right? So again, this goes all the way back to professionals. Negotiating with professionals is a bad idea. You need to then speak to the seller and say, this is the expectation on time frame. Let's agree to this. Great. This is the information we need. Great. And let them drive the process. Question?
Have you got an order of magnitude confirmation? We talk this at $10,000 DD, $100,000 of EV. I know you've got the data going big.
Yeah.
Is there a rule of thumb to the size of the enterprise with EV and
Yeah.
what cost to actually
The easiest answer to that is depends whose money you're spending. So, for instance, a private equity fund on a deal that we had spent $1 million on a $28 million EV deal. Right? It's not their money. They just want to make sure the risk is done. And on the flip side, you might have a $20 million deal which will spend, maybe 100 grand across the DD, depending on how complex it is. And if it's really clean, then it's a lot easier. Jason's rule of thumb's about right. Like your 2%, generally speaking, is kind of in the ballpark for deal size. But that doesn't apply to a $3 million deal, right? Like it does get crunched to a point, and then kind of economies of, lawyers and accountants are quite expensive at the moment. So that kind of gets to a point. In our office, we do everything on fixed cost, right? Stage by stage, here's the fixed cost. This is what's going to happen, because we don't want to get to a point where we're incentivized to take longer. That doesn't work. We want deals to get done. And the second is we don't want to be incentivized where a client's like, I shouldn't do this deal, but I've got this massive whip. It's like, well, there's the cost. If you want to walk away, you've only spent X amount of dollars. So I'm happy to kind of scope out a deal on a particular example, but the reality is it can go quite high. I'm just trying to think, at the moment, there's a 5 million EV deal, and like the FDD, including tax, is sort of 50K on that. So that's from a sort of a mid-tier that's come a little bit down. So like that's a ballpark, and go from 20 to 100 very easily. And then obviously from a private equity point of view, they will happily pay whatever in real terms. Yeah. So summary, this is the most important step in many respects. It's the most kind of daunting because it takes the most time. It's also the step that kills almost every deal, right? So really important to set up the expectations of the seller and the seller's accountant in particular, and work through that process. The other thing just to bear in mind is when you approach, so right now, if you went and spoke to an SME, the accountant will definitely not have the financial statements done for FY24. It won't happen. So if you're asking them to be done, just remember the seller is having to spend money to accommodate your due diligence request. Right, so that's the psyche. You've got to think, okay, they're now spending money with their accountant to accelerate it, and the accountant's like, okay, that's fine, I'm happy with that. But that's the position now the seller's in. You're asking them to extend that, so play the psyche. How do you manage that process? Right now, you still got to do it, but you just got to remember, you're asking them to be charged more and more through this process, so make it as efficient as possible, and really be clear on expectations, both from the seller's accountant and the seller has to drive the accountant, not the other way around, okay? That's a lot easier said than done. So the transaction documents, which we could spend days on, this is typically where most of our clients kind of just close their eyes and just go, we know we need it, but like, just it's a dark art, so just deal with it. The reality is from this room's high level perspective, really the key question is, what are you actually buying? Because that's going to set everything. Are you buying the shares in the entity? Are you buying the business, or are you buying just pure assets, right? So typically, if you've got a share purchase, that's actually the most straightforward in many respects. But most SMEs who have not corporatized or professionalized will use a lawyer that they know, not the lawyer that they should use. So the lawyer that they know goes, yep, Gary, sorry if there's any Garys in the room. Gary, yep, we can do that transaction for you, absolutely no issues. Yeah, we've done the odd business sale before, that's fine. In the back of their head, they're thinking, I've done a cafe and I've done Janet's little bookshop or whatever. And you've asked Gary, you're spending 15 mil on this business. And his lawyer's like, yep, absolutely no problem, because they also do Gary's wills. They did Gary's property conveyance, and they'll look after Gary's daughter's personal injury claim because she slipped on a train. Right? That's Gary's lawyer, that's Gary's deal team. And so you're going to go into this process and you're going to have this really hard time of working through like education on the process, right? It's really, really, really hard, right? From our point of view, and you can go and ask Baha at lunch, like there are some stories, it's just like, why don't they get this? This is not difficult, right? And it's because they just don't do it every day, right? Their expectation's one thing. The reality is this is how deals get done. I'll give you an example. We're on a roll-up mandate at the moment in the wet hire rail space. Super niche, really good business, but very niche. And we approached a company that's doing really good revenue, really good free cash out the bottom, to take Jason's point. And we said, this is the data we need. We're interested in acquiring you. This is the data we need. We know you're under contract with ARTC and that sort of thing. And they said, yep, we're not going to give you that data. We're going to give you redacted data. So, well, that's going to be difficult to come up with a price, but okay. It's not going to be a share sale. It's going to be an asset sale. So, well, that's very difficult because you're bound in contracts. So anyway, that's going to impact the risk of the deal. And what's sort of your traditional range for this type of business? We gave the range, that's fine. We got the data. The data was given to us in May 2024 for the period ending 31 December 2023. Great, well, that's hopeless, but whatever. So we sort of, you make your adjustments, assessments, your assumptions, whatever, you put a deal on the table. So there's the number, right? Immediately they go, no, this is outrageous. How dare you lowball us? It's like, okay, let's pause that conversation. How did we get from I want to transact to how dare you come at me with this lowball when I gave the range of what these assets go for and we're within the range, right? And the reality is because they focused on one singular thing, which was the assets and the valuation that their insurer gave them on the assets, right? It's like, well, one, assets are never transacted on insurance value. It's liquidated value. If you go to a lender and say, hey, we want to leverage up this asset, they say, great, what's the liquidated value? And then they deduct about 10% off that. And that's what the value they'll give you on leverage. And secondly, without data and without up-to-date data, we were completely in the dark, which all we did was just defend them, right? Now, it's still in the process. But the reality is, what are we buying, right? And from our point of view, we wanted the share acquisition because we needed the contracts, there's far less issues and risks of that transaction. What they were prepared to sell were basically assets at asset value on an insured basis, not assets at asset value on a Grays Online basis, right? So fundamentally, what are you buying, right? In business and asset sales, typically you're then going to look at employee lists, asset lists, and a whole range of things like that. With an asset list, it is never ever correct. It's just not, right? So spend time, particularly if you're in any sort of manufacturing heavy industry, anything with a warehouse, you're going to have to walk the site and actually photograph, ask really dumb questions like, do you own that fire extinguisher? No. Okay, well, that's not included, right? Do you own that over there? Oh, actually, that's in the other company. Well, what other company? Like, I'm telling you, these are the things that you get. It's like, that prime mover there, whose is that? It's got all your badging on it. Oh, that's our subcontractors. Okay, why is that on your asset list? Oh, maybe that is ours. It's like, okay. So you literally have to go through the process because at the end of the day one, you're like, what assets are mine, right? And how do we manage them? Okay. It also impacts all of your kind of assessments of how your CapEx, etc. Right. The employee is the other one. Most SMEs don't have long service leave on their books at all. And when you ask them to produce it, a lot of the time they're like, we don't know when the employee actually started. So it's like, okay, well, it's not really my problem. But that's a huge battle, right? The other thing is employees versus contractors. There's been a big change in the sort of Fair Work Act as of August and some decisions of the High Court, which have significantly impacted the definition of contractor and employee, right? And so a lot of businesses we see have great subcontractor models and they're brilliant, like the margin's beautiful. It's like you get it, like happy days, and that's the reality is they're not paying superannuation. They're not actually paying the proper award rate because they don't need to, and it's just putting risk onto someone else. The reality is, the ATO has been very clear on this now. It's like, no, that engagement there, that's going to be classed as an employee. And if you buy the shares in that entity, you're assuming that risk. And even if you put in all the reps and warranties you like, the reality is when you go and sue that person, they will have nothing. So you can't assume they're going to get anything. And especially if they buy it, if you came to us, we'd put you into a trust. You'd have the shares in a trust. You'd sell the business. The trust would be wound up. See you later. They're in Mauritius. You're suing them in the federal court saying you owe us $2 million and he doesn't care. He's drinking Mutais or whatever they're called. So professionals, you need obviously professionals engaged at this. I say this and everyone's like, of course, you're an idiot. Of course you get people. No, people don't, right? It's literally, it's like, oh, this is the I'll do it myself, right? Law Society standard contract, that'll be fine. It's not fine. So please. The other item in this is your reps and warranties, right? And how to manage that. So reps and warranties is one of those kind of and indemnities, right? It's one of those things it's sort of the sticking point of contracts. It's kind of the thing that's usually Schedule 1 that people kind of gloss over. It's actually really important. Some things to consider as you get larger in transaction value is whether you should consider a W&I insurance policy to be tacked on, right? And that essentially is putting some risk onto an insurer. You pay a premium for that, but then if there's any sort of issue you can kind of claim on that, they can then go after the seller, and it just makes it smoother, right? It's used a lot in the independent or sponsor space. It's not used a lot in the ETA space. We actually just closed one which had warranty insurance in it because of the transaction, and it does actually displace some risk and is worthwhile considering. Not cheap, but the reality is, depending on transaction size, might be a really good investment to consider. So takeaway is understand what you're actually buying. Make sure that your team in this, your deal team, know what they're doing, and really be aware of what's the seller's deal team actually doing. Do they know this? Quiz them on this. I've never met a lawyer that says they haven't done a business sale, right? So ask a couple of questions beyond that, like, oh, what was the size of the last one you did? How complex was it, right? So understand that process. Like our last contract was north of 150 million, right? Okay, so we understand that process, right? Really key, you are entitled to ask the question, so ask the question, right? Pre-completion, so now we're sort of getting quite in the weeds here, but pre-completion is sort of forgotten about, so we sort of sign the SPA, and now we're away, and so great, everyone's happy, great, we're signing ceremony, happy days, and then, oh, sorry, question, yep. Austin, what's the typical coverage we're seeing in warranty insurance? So Austin's an insurance broker.
Yeah, it insures the warranties and the indemnity. So basically, there's been some sort of breach of misrepresentation in that, and then you suffer a loss for that, where then insures the full value of the transaction. So rates on it probably 1 to 1.5% of the purchase price. So it'll be more than much, meaning in there. Now it'll give you price for 5 years and then pay you out about $100. That's something really well. Obviously, if you check balances or the thing for it,
yeah, Austin and his team do a great job, so speak to them if you want insurance. But the prerequisite for that is having all your due diligence done because they asked for that. Right? So pre-completion. So from a share purchase point of view, your change of control and approvals and waivers. So every lease under the sun has you can't do anything unless you let us know, right? So it's just that sort of process. The key things are when you've got material contracts, right? The biggest contracts, material contracts in a transaction, they will always have a change of control, right? And the reality is you've got to let them know this is what's happening, and they might have a process and say, oh, well, we're going to qualify the buyer and work out if it's okay or not okay, right? Dividend statements, and this is something I don't know that Jason touched on this, but when you look at transaction structuring, every single uneducated SME owner and accountant never thinks about pre-settlement dividends. It's a super easy win where you can go, oh, I got all this money on the balance sheet. And they're like, well, you're going to have to pay me more. It's like, no, that's yours. Normalise the working capital, that's yours. Any excess is yours. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's good. So I get that out. Yeah, you get that out. Okay, and that suddenly completely changes the conversation. We've got one at the moment that has 22 million retained earnings and 23 million of cash on the balance sheet. They do not need any of that, right? That's completely surplus. And in their discussion, it was, that's ours. It's like, yeah, of course it's yours. We have to work that through in DD and all that process, but that's yours. That's on top of your normalised working capital. That's not the buyer's. We're sell side this. That's yours, right? So immediately it brought the tension down to be like, oh, okay. So I'm not just giving the business with all this excess cash to the buyer. It's like, no, there's a process here, but it is almost always forgotten about up front, and you need to educate them, and then it's almost always forgotten about sort of as we head to a completion. And then your conditioned precedents. So these are whatever's in the term sheet, whatever's then agreed on in the SPA, and actually working through the process. They can be very, very long. they can be non-existent, right? That's entirely a negotiated point. One of the things I would say is that where we see deals die, where they shouldn't die, is where someone goes, this is a non-negotiable that actually could be converted into a negotiable and dealt with prior to completion. So it might be, this is a material supply, you don't have a contract, that's a massive risk, I'm going to walk away. No, that's just a precondition, just get them to do a contract. And in fact, give them the terms of the contract you want and make that process, right? So we need that. Business asset purchase, it's the same sort of thing, it's just a lot more, right? Business asset sales are a real pain in the ass from a lawyer's point of view because it's just heaps of documents. Yet people don't want to pay us as much for it, to be blunt. And there's a lot more because you've got to take all the employees over, etc. So pain in the ass. Obviously, your professionals get engaged. Really important on that point. Transaction completion. So there's just a process that needs to happen here, right? The settlement checklist, your resolutions, deliverables, the title docs, assuming you have title docs, that's the other thing, most of them won't have them. Business records, again, access, keys and passwords. So as a lot of businesses have migrated to the cloud, lots of people actually don't know their tech systems, they don't know what they have to hand over, they don't know the process. So being clear in due diligence that flushes out that, just give a really clear list, like have an Excel spreadsheet that they can actually input or a Google sheet that they can actually just put it in. So make it really simple for them. Board appointment consents and resignations if they need to, bank authorities, and then deeds of assignment and novation if it's not a CP, right? So there's a lot of work in that. People think, oh, we've signed the documents, that's done. Actually, that's typically where a lot of work then starts to actually get the transaction files. And you notice there's no financing in this. I haven't touched on when banks come into this and their desire and their all that sort of stuff or whitewash or anything like that. That's a whole nother thing. Post-completion is just tidying up. So ASIC, your working capital. So again, this is where it gets a bit spicy for the accountants and working through, oh, what was it actually? This was the estimate. How are we going to actually adjust for this? We've now run it, all that sort of thing. Guarantees are the other thing we see some problems of landlords not releasing personal guarantees or financiers being sloppy or PPSR registrations that no one's considered or looked for and actually getting that. And then any earn-out calculations subject to how long that is, right? So in your mind, you've got to think post-completion, if we have an earn-out for 3 years, does not finish for 3 years. Because you have an obligation at that point. If they can prove it, there it is. And there's always a fun thing to do. Look, fun for me anyway, but you watch the ASX and they do an acquisition. You get the understanding of the structure, you follow that deal through, and I'm going to suggest 8 out of 10 have an earn-out dispute. You think, oh, that's interesting. Why is that? Go and read it and you can understand why there's an earn-out dispute. Maggie Beer just had one recently. It's a good read. I'd recommend that. So it's post-completion. And then step 8, we heard yesterday, your operational uplift, right? So the number one thing we see from people who buy a business, they get so eager to get in and change. Don't touch anything for 90 days, right? We're very clear with guys, particularly even in roll-ups. It's like you bought it for a particular reason. Typically, it's earnings accretive. So let's just pause for a minute. And we have this sort of, I either say it's kind of observe and serve, right? Don't go in and tell people you're the new boss. Go in and they know that's going to be the case, but observe and serve. So understand what people do. Get on the factory floor, get in a truck, get on an IT desk, whatever it is. Actually get in and do their job with them and ask them to help you to do their job. And then one, you're going to build their trust. 2 is you're going to know where all of the operational issues are. And 3, they're actually going to have some good ideas on how to fix it, is our experience. The second is your 90-day strategy. So if you're doing that yourself, great. Otherwise, get someone else in to help you do that, because once you're in the business, very hard to get on the business or out of the business. So there's a process there. The operational improvements and timeline, in our experience, 2 to 3 times longer than you think. So if you think 6 months, think 12 or 18. If you think 1 year, do the maths, right? But again, go back to your FDD, your LDD, and your operational report. You've paid good money, take it out, write the list of what you need to adjust. If your new accounting firm that's coming in is going to do it, give them the playbook and say, here are the issues that need to be fixed, right? Get them to do it. You don't need to do it. And then your 4 pillars, right? Governance, finance, operations, and people. You need those 4 to be sorted. If they're not sorted, then you've got a problem. Fundamentally, governance drops off because no one thinks about it. Finance is one that everyone thinks about. Operations is something that everyone thinks about. And people's kind of we understand. But the reality is they're equally as important for different aspects of the business. And then, because we're in ETA, don't forget about the bolt-on and the power of the bolt-on. So some really quick lessons. Beware of the sunk cost fallacy. all right? I've just spent 60 grand on due diligence. You've red flagged that there's a massive issue, James, but I really want to do the deal. It's like, well, would you do the deal if you knew there was an issue in the beginning? No, then why would you do it now? Oh, I've spent 60 grand. That's a sunk cost fallacy, right? So you're in the game. It's an expensive game to play, but once you're in it, it's a great game. The reality is you've got to go in eyes wide open and trust the process. It is designed to flush out problems, and you then rank the problems of non-negotiable, negotiable, things that I can live with, whatever, right? So be very clear on that. If it walks like a duck, looks like a duck, sounds like a duck, it's a duck. Don't think it's something else, like, but it's really good. No, it's a duck, right? Just trust that process. It is more often than not, we have arguments with clients, and it is an argument to say, you wouldn't do this deal if you knew about this when you put your term sheet in. Why are you doing the deal now? Oh, I've spent the money. I can see the blue sky. It's a beautiful picture. It's like a rainbow and unicorns. Unicorns don't exist. Rainbows come out after rain, right? So if you want to see a rainbow, find where it's raining. That's not our job. Our job is to tell you, is this a good transaction or not? And does it stack up to the quality that you need in your investment thesis? Okay, we've got a job to do. Now, you as an investment manager have a job to do. So would you buy this asset, right? No deal is better than a bad deal. You get into a bad deal, it's really hard to get out of a bad deal. It takes 5 times as long to turn around. Unless you are a distressed acquirer, Allegro, Anchorage, to name a few, who have enormous amounts of money behind them and operational teams out of the Big Four, buying distressed companies is a really, really, really hard game. So it's better to walk away. Make sure your deal team has experience with SME deals. Like I said, Gary's bloke, good guy, knows his way around a conveyance, not the guy to have on a $20 million deal or a $15 million deal or even a $5 million deal. If you see the Law Society contract, go and speak to the seller, right? And have a conversation about why we shouldn't use that contract, okay? And there's lots of reasons we can talk about that. Super clear on non-negotiables, super clear on negotiables. People forget about the second bit, right? It's like when you think about doing the deal, work out why they want to do the deal and how many of those fit into negotiables, but maybe tell them the things that are negotiable. Actually, the earn-out is negotiable. Your deferred payment, yeah, we could work that out. Some of these kind of things here, how long you've got to be around, that's a non-negotiable or whatever the case may be, right? But be super clear on that. Aware of your strengths and embrace your weaknesses. So we see this too often where the client sort of overreaches in what they think their strength is and they don't acknowledge their particular weakness. So we might have a very good operating, a founder who's on a roll-up strategy. Finance is not their strength. They should not be doing your modelling, right? Like we say to them, that's not your strength. We point someone to do that. Your job is to assess the quality of the operations underneath the hood. So be aware of that. And in my experience, and our experience, humility creates deals, right? The day you tell the guy that's run a manufacturing business or girl for 15 years that there's problems in their business is the day that they think, what do you know? What do you know? You're just sitting here in your nice suit saying, hey, this is how much your business is worth and these are the reasons because of all these problems. He's like, mate, I'd take really good money out of this every year. All right, so approaching it on the basis of it's a good asset. We're in a different space. We're not running it as the family. We've got a distinctive purpose. Our end buyer wants to look at an asset like this. There's a bit of transformation. There's a bit of improvement. All right, but it's still fundamentally a very good house. Great bones. We just want to change the colour of the paint. All right, but actually approaching it in that manner gets deals done. Sellers actually start to go, oh, this buyer, they're really good. We've got a deal at the moment. The seller and the buyer have just negotiated a $1.8 million deal, value accretive in the next year when the buyer will have the business because the seller and the buyer got on so well. They were like, hey, we're in DD, but you know what, can you help us on this? Yeah, great. We'll go to WA and do a deal. It's like, oh, that's a pretty good relationship, right? So thinking of the next 90 days, the next 12 months, the next 2 years, I would back that particular buyer to have a pretty good result if that seller's that, in with that process, to trust them in that and recognise they've got some strengths, he's got some weaknesses and how you can work together. So humility, in our view, creates deals. Like I said, ETA Central, It's gone live. There's an NDA up there, a term sheet, an offer cover letter. You'll notice in the offer cover letter, it's like fake manufacturing or something. I just can't remember the name. But there's a certain structure to that. That works, right? I haven't just given a term sheet and offer structure that's like, oh, this is nice. It's like that gets used in deals every single week and it works. So actually use that methodology. And it's not something you just send and hope. It's a take, deliver personally, hand over the desk, and then send the email after the meeting, right? And then the bolt-on readiness assessments, 20 questions. I think you've got to score, in our view, more than 15. It's simple yes, no. Yes is 1 point, no is 0 points, right? If you get to 15, it's time to consider. You get to 20, you're ready to rock and roll, right? Most businesses never get to 20 on the first pass. If you do, I'll shout your lunch. If you want to get in touch, there's my email, obviously ETA Central, and I don't mind hanging out on LinkedIn. So more than happy to talk to people. We love this space. And yeah, thanks for coming for the last 2 days.